Hello everyone. It's nice to see you all again. This time we're going to study one of the most tragic events which occurred during the Middle Ages. And we're going to talk about the witch hunt. Satan uses various methods in order to try and annihilate this gospel. From the earliest stages of Christianity until Constantine officially recognized Christianity, for about 300 years, Satan used various methods to persecute and oppress Christians in a national level in order to annihilate the gospel. However, the more Satan persecuted and oppressed the gospel, the more fearless Christians became and closer they became to the Lord. They had become the food for violent beasts in the Colosseum. They were slain by the sword, burnt at the stake. It went through various difficulties and hardships, but amazingly, compared to the persecution, the work of the gospel burned more passionately. Satan realized that, just because of the persecution, I cannot annihilate the gospel through that. I cannot eliminate the church. So Satan changed his method. Now, Constantine officially recognized Christianity. Then there was the freedom of religion, and it seemed like Christians now had the freedom to live spiritual life. On the other hand, Satan was not leading the Christians to serve the gospel more powerfully. Instead, Christians were being secularized and becoming more relaxed and lazy. And as they flowed following the flesh, Satan did the work of putting Christians to sleep and corrupting them. And I will talk about this a little bit more later on. After the freedom of religion and the freedom of spiritual life was allowed, Christians, they were corrupted and secularized. And their spiritual aspect was disappearing little by little. And many people were saddened by this. They realized, this is not it. This is wrong. We served the Lord with passion during that period of severe persecution. Now it's much better and we're free to serve the Lord. But we're becoming lazy and powerless and losing strength spiritually. Why are our spiritual lives like this? So some people, they would go into the desert and lead a monastic life. So many monasteries formed. You can see that many monks would seek God in their loneliness, and they would read the Bible, and they longed for the things of the spiritual world, and they sought after God, and they were very diligently going forward in that direction. And on the other side, during that time, Satan allowed the false religions to develop more and more. And what happened, the false religions started to grow. And false religions that didn't have the gospel, they started to persecute and go against the gospel. So when we read the Bible, if we look at the history of Christianity, there's nothing better than the false religion that deceived people more. And it gave so much more difficulty to people. And it hunted their soul. It's a scary, scary tool. False religion is the best piece of art that Satan has ever made. People, this religion sells the name of God. It gives worship services, allows people to go to church, and they pray, and they provide a way to volunteer, and they listen to sermons, and they have fellowship. But the life of a gospel is missing. People, they go to church. They say they believe in God. And that's why I serve God like this. I volunteer like this, and I do spiritual life like this. Of course, I've received salvation. They think that they can go to heaven, that they have already received salvation. But the gospel of forgiveness of sins has never come upon their soul, and they never realize it. People, Satan has done so much work during the Middle Ages through the false religion. But one of the most tragic things amongst those things is the witch hunt. Many people do not know about the witch hunt. But when we read the history, we can think about this to ourselves. How did this happen? How could people do these kinds of things? How can the life of innocent people of the world be killed like this? And how can people be afflicted like this? It's such a misfortunate event that witch hunt was. In the first church, the Emperor of Rome sat at the judgment seat and persecuted the Christians. But in the Middle Ages, as the time passed, false religious leaders, under the name of God, sat in the place of God and accused many people of being witches. Under the title of eliminating those witches, they took many lives of innocent people. They took their possessions, all their stuff. And many people, they suffered great affliction. We cannot express how much afflictions people suffered. So why did these ideas about witches arise in the Middle Ages? Before the 11th century, the witch was someone from a fantasy. But after the 13th century, society in Europe became unstable and confused. On top of that, a virulent infection spread throughout Europe. The infection, which could not be prevented with humans, was spread, wiping out much of Europe. Also, during this period of change in time, people were confused and anxious as they began to believe that these disasters were due to the works of the devils and by witches. On top of that, literature used nonsense imagination, which played a role in producing many useless imaginations about witches. And as the religious reformation began, many people opened their eyes toward the spiritual world, and they opened their eyes towards how the doctrine which the Roman Catholic Church spoke about was different from the Bible. That's not the Word of God. And so many ministers are corrupted, and Catholics are going on the wrong path. The people who cried out about reformation of that began to arise. And furthermore, Catholic religious circles needed an object to put that negative focus off of them and onto someone else. So Satan used false religion and made women who were of inferior status to appear as a new target in society. In this social atmosphere, witch hunters began to appear. The magic story of the witch hunters began to spread. And Pope Innocent VIII announced a papal bull and recognized the existence of the witch, which allowed people to chase after witches. Now, women were considered to be directly responsible for the corruption of men. They were understood to be individuals who easily accepted the temptation of the devil or of magic. And generally, witch hunts or witch trials was a process from the end of the Middle Ages until today, about the questioning, judgment, up to the punishment regarding the witch or the work of magic that happened in Europe and the North America. And so, that's what they were called at the time. That's why it's called the witch hunt or witch trial. when we look at the history of a witch, what we call a witch is the general term of the devil, which has the form of a woman. At that time, people thought that witches were the ones who cured disease by using herbs or casting spells. When the witches cursed you, crops would wither and die, and it would rain for the increase of the production of harvest, or they would prick a doll with needles and make other people die. And people that did that, they called them witches. Also, people thought that witches turned into animals such as cats, toads, or rabbits with 3 feet. The history of witches goes back a very long time. And there's still ideas about witches beginning from ancient Egypt or India, and it spread wide in Greece and Rome. In Africa, they still have the idea of witches even today. The Middle-aged Europeans, as they experienced extreme diseases, famine, flood, wars, and death, lived in extreme materialistic and mental pain. As they expressed this ancient heart through their religious methods, people began to fall into extreme superstitions as well. Therefore, they increased their religious ceremony, and as they worshipped holy people, they wanted to receive comfort inside their hearts. At that time, the Catholic Church said that people who have fallen to magic worship the power of Satan, and they try to receive worldly profits. So, they called Wicca, which was the ceremony from ancient polytheists of worshipping Satan. And Wicca is a ceremony of worshipping Satan from ancient polytheistic nations. They would give offerings to the devil, sacrifices including humans as well. They believed they could sell their souls and gain supernatural powers instead. In Europe, they had opposed witches up to the Middle Ages. They would punish only on antisocial activities, and if they weren't any special antisocial activities, they didn't put any extreme restrictions. But after the failure of the Crusades, however, in order for the Catholic Church to overcome social anxiety or religious crisis, they began to attack heretic spiritual life at the end of the 12th century. And up to the beginning of the 18th century, they hunted witches indiscriminately. Around this time, those people who were called witches were those who had given up their spiritual life with Christ, made contacts with the devil and served the devil, and used the devil's power that was given unto them as a price. And fly in the air, they would attend the convention for witches, which were characteristics of those who had relationships with the devil. They also had the nail marks of the devil on their body. The witches were mostly women, but there were rare cases of male witches as well. Now, when they are considered to be witches, and when they were caught, they would receive judgment and they would be executed. The position of the executed witch was taken, and the Lord's bishop or heresy investigators divided all of the possessions. And for the witch hunters, the witch hunt was a business that made a lot of profit. Ironically, the witch hunt reached its peak in the 16th and 17th century, which is called the period of humanism. And in the 18th century, where the witch was not considered a threat, religiously or in society, the oppression plunged much, and it was considered pathological. What kind of suspicion did the witches receive, and how were they arrested? So let's look at this. First, witches were suspected through rumors. When there was a rumor, the suspect was accused, and then extreme torture was applied, and he or she was forced to confess. Most of the suspects were hanged and burnt after that questioning. So when there was a rumor that so-and-so person was a witch, that person was arrested. Then that person was tortured and was transformed into a witch. When a person nominated a witch that he knew, that person is also arrested during the interrogation.
신문 과정에 자신이
And
마녀를 지명하는 경우에
in addition, the children of the witch were also considered to be witches. Sometimes, the children of the witch were fabricated as a witch through the torture, and sometimes they were put to death by being burnt at the stake without torture. Among those that were sacrificed, the corpses of young children who couldn't even distinguish between right and wrong were often discovered. The reason why these children were discovered with the corpses of witches was because the mother was considered to be a witch, and the children of the witches were considered to be witches as well. And that is why they were all executed together. During the investigation process, when the suspect is not home at night, or when they cannot tell of their destination, it became proof that this is because they participated in a witch convention. When they did not scream or when they did not shed tears even though torture was applied, it was the sign of a witch. When a person was shocked excessively when they were arrested, it was considered a sign of the witch, or being excessively calm was also a habit of a witch. Eventually, when a person was considered suspicious of being a witch, there was no way to get away out of that suspicion. So, through the instigation of the false religious people, whether they have sinned or not, those people that were being suspected of being witches were sent to religious judgment and they were executed indiscriminately. In 1484, the book title Malleus Maleficarum was published. It deplored how the Pope was not taking legal action even though a number of witches existed. And 3 years later, Malleus Maleficarum, which was published as a theology book and authorship of heresy, judges of University of Cologne, they included the theory of how one sells the soul to the devil and becomes a witch, and explained the history of magic, and also explained how to discover a witch and chase after them. On top of that, it explained the reason why witches existed. It was considered of 3 volumes, which researched the topic in detail. In the beginning, the duty of heresy hunt was only limited to the bishops of the area. However, Pope Gregory was not satisfied, and he structured a special investigation force where they could not only concentrate on expelling heresy in one place, but anywhere, anytime. Then, the Dominican order had all 3 steps of knowledge, which was enough for the argument for the theology and couldn't be criticized. They had strong religious enthusiasm about heretical hunts, and the Dominican order was the organization where abstinence and living a clean life was very thorough. And 2 theologians from the Dominican order went around the areas for a long time and put all their efforts into heretical hunts. Heresies were not limited to only religious problems. People or animals that were dying due to infectious diseases, famine, or natural disasters were all considered because of the heresies. Especially very miserable contents about sex were considered as well. For example, abortion or being barren was considered to stem from heresy. Religious heretics were considered to be the same as witches that committed adultery with the devil and created all these strange things. They were called the theologians from the Dominican order, and they expressed their experience through the book called The Hammer of Witches. This book was used as a guide for the witch hunt for a long time. When you look at the book called The Hammer of Witches, the book was written only for the purpose of the convict of magic. When you look at the book, you can see that the guide says the woman who doesn't like to go to church is a witch, or a person who is very zealous in going to church may be a witch as well. And when you are branded as a witch,
한번
the court didn't have a need to show sympathy to the accused.
안에 동정을 보일 필요가 없었습니다.
It was existence that was given up, who could never go back to the church.
마녀에 대한 체포
The process of arresting a witch was very simple. When there was accusation, it was enough for the arrest.
세상의 소문으로
And
체포가 가능했습니다.
According to statistical sources by Robert Bland, who has analyzed more than 10,000 witch trials that happened in Germany, England, Switzerland, and Finland, and Spain, he says that almost half of them
기소된 사람 가운데 많이
were being accused of being a witch and they were executed. In the Middle Ages, there were several methods for the witch hunt, and there are 4 representative tests.
네 가지 시험이 있어요.
And one was the test of the tear. Another was the test of the needle. Then there was the water test. And finally was the fire test.
자, 이 사람이 이제 마녀에
Now, whether this person is a witch or not,
해야 되는데
and the witch has to be hunted out. And in order to hunt the witch, they would use a method called the tear test. And when you look at the book called The Hammer of Witches, because the witches are evil, they don't have tears. So it was a test whether the accused can shed tears or not.
시험에 보라고 나와 있습니다.
Therefore, one must shed tears to prove the absence of sin.
실증에 보여야 했습니다. 왜냐하면
It's because it was recorded in the books that the witches were evil and they couldn't shed tears. The accused had to shed tears to prove that they were not witches.
아니라는 걸 입증해 보여야 되는데
But it's not easy just to force a common person to shed tears. Consequently, when one didn't shed tears,
눈물을 흘리지
that person was recognized as a witch
마녀로
and then executed.
소형을 당하고 재산을 빼앗기고 말할 수 없는
And
고문을
the property would be taken away and the person would receive unspeakable torture. The second wood is the needle of the test needle.
바늘로 특정한 부위를 찔러서
And then they would stab them with a needle and at a special part of the body, and if there was no pain or bleeding, then they would be witches. Or when a person was falling into the water and if they sunk or if they held onto a hot metal bar and get burnt, then they would be witches. These nonsense judgments appeared at that time. When women were first caught, all their clothes were stripped away, and all the hair on the body was shaven. And then they were tied to a wire rack.
묶어가지고 온 몸을
And then they would be pricked by the needle on their whole body. Why? To find out whether there was a mark of the devil on the body or not, by pricking them with the needle. When they were pricked by the needle, if anyone's face was distorted from the pain of the needle prick, they were let go. But when their faces were expressionless during the needle pricks, they were clearly judged to be witches.
이 심판관들은 마녀이니
And that's the judges would say that. People would tie her hands and her feet and put her in a bathtub called the witch bathhouse.
욕조에 집어넣습니다.
And when she was put into the bathtub and she floated,
오르면 마녀
she would be concluded to be a witch. And when she was concluded to be a witch, her possessions were all given as a reward to the person who tortured her.
고문관은
Every time the torturer transformed a common person into a witch,
마녀로 둔갑시킬
they became rich. The person whose job was to prick with a needle
직업으로 삼은 사람
would now make equipment
이제
that when they were pricked with the needle, the needle
뒤로
would be pushed in on itself, forcing many women to be turned into witches, so they would make a lot of money. And history records this for us.
마녀 재판은
Most of the witch trials progressed for the sake of the confession, insisting that fantasies that can never happen were sins and must receive the confession.
아주 잔혹한
So in the witch trials, cruel torture and execution was committed. The women who were chosen as the sacrifice for the witch trials were mainly old widows, or women who weren't married, or highly intelligent women. Women who were eccentric or said things that were displeasing according to men's perspective
말을 하는 여성들
often became the target. Also, widows with a lot of money
바보들이
were informed by special men relatives who were after their property. Among those who were suspicious of being witches were rich widows,
부유한 과부들이 많았습니다.
especially rich widows with no family, were often caught as witches.
마녀로 잡혀가는 경우가 많았습니다.
In addition, witch hunters caught a lot of people under the title of worshiping the devil.
많은 사람들을
Now, the needle test is a sign of one who receives salvation.
구원받은 자의 이제 표식으로 그 이마에
And when you look at the
그 구약
Old Testament, on the forehead there is a mark.
찍는다는
Using that word,
점을
they invented a logic that corrupted devils had the signs that cannot be erased, which is the same as the witches.
따라서
The judges would observe the naked body of the women who were accused of being the witch.
다른 여자들의 나체를 관찰하고
And to observe better, they would burn all of the hair or eyebrows if there was a wart, boil, or freckle. They would say that it was a spot of a witch.
기미, 주근깨 이런 것들이 나오면 이건
Then they would press or poke the spot with a needle,
그 자리를
and they would test to see if they felt it or if they would bleed or not. They considered that to be the test,
그래서 이제
because the witches used all their blood. They wouldn't bleed even if they were poked by the needles.
하고 그렇게 여겼어요.
That's what they thought. Then the third test was called the fire test. The fire test is the test in order to prove that they are not guilty by seeing whether they can endure the burning metal or get hurt.
찢어지는 것을 견딜 수 있는지
When this is offered to them and the accused agrees, then she became a witch. It is because they agreed.
그 여자는 마녀가 됩니다.
The accusers believed that they could endure the pain with the help of,
왜냐하면
because they're a witch.
하면 왜 이제 마녀가 되는
The reason is they would be accused.
이런 난관을
They believe with the help of the evil spirit they could overcome the pain. When the witches went through the trial, while
마녀가
the suspicion of the witch was being tested, all the costs that were spent must be paid for by the one who received the suspicion.
고문 도구
Borrowing the tools for the torture, paying the torture technician for the torture of the women, paying for the judge who was attending the trial, the tax of the witch to pay for the pope, all the time and expenses that were taken when the witch was arrested, and when it was clear that she was a witch, the expense and the price of the casket for the burning at the stake.
마녀세 등을
All things had to be paid for by the one who was accused of being a witch.
화형에 처해진 이후에도
Even after
한번 처해지는 형벌이 바로 전 재산
Even after she was burned at the stake, one more punishment was that all her possessions were taken away.
상으로 자신이
So the witch has to pay the salary of the pope, and the executor still received the pain of torture.
고통을 당하는 거예요.
And at last she was to disinherit all her property to the one who murdered her. And when we read the history of this during the Middle Ages, witches went through unspeakable torture.
우리가 이 중세 역사를
Now,
보면 마녀들이
The torture appears as a necessary element
고문을 당했습니다.
in the witch trials.
그래서
And
고문은
eventually,
재판에 거의 필수적인
witches died of forced torture, and then they had to confess.
상습적인 고문과 자백에 의해서 죽어갔습니다.
There was a rare case of a young girl who confessed to her father that she was a witch.
아버지에게 자백하고
So her father reported his daughter, and they entered into the witch trial.
등장한 경우도
And
있었습니다.
it happened sometime. And
정말
truly,
인간
human wisdom was all used to apply torture.
고문을 가했는데
So people received all the torture that couldn't be expressed in words.
당했습니다.
And numerous people died
수많은
because of these witch trials. And
특히 1500년을
close to bordering the year 1500, the arrest, judgment, and legal action of the witches spread throughout Europe as if it was an infectious disease. So a very cruel and extreme witch trial wiped out Europe. In March 5th of 2003, Pope John Paul II, following the direction of Pope John Paul II,
이 마녀 재판에 사과를
the Vatican made an apology about these witch trials.
교회가 하느님의
The Catholic Church recognized all their wrongdoings that they had caused under the excuse of the will of God.
마녀 재판에
They also recognized their wrongdoings about the witch trials and asked for the forgiveness of the people of the world under the Catholic name.
어떤 역사의
But in the history recorded history, this witch trial existed not only in the Catholic sphere, but also existed in the descendants of the Calvinists.
동일하게 시행되었다.
And
기록되어 있습니다.
truly, the witch trials were an absurd and misfortunate mistake.
불행한
And history shows us that Satan executed
거짓된
many innocent people and made them pitiful through the false religion.
소형시키고 비참하게 했는가를 역사가 우리에게 보여주고 있는 것입니다.
And today, that will be all for our lecture. I'll see you next time.